There are certain deaths in Hollywood history that don't just end a life, they end an illusion. For 14 years, one man convinced an entire country that he was indestructible. He was the biggest man on the biggest ranch on television, a mountain of a human being who could lift a grown man off his feet with one arm and make a child laugh with the other. And then, in the span of a single afternoon, he was gone. No warning that mattered. No slow decline the public could brace for. Just a routine hospital visit that turned into the final chapter of a story nobody saw coming. This is the story of Dan Blocker, the actor who played Haas Cartwright on Bonanza, and of the woman who loved him quietly for 20 years, and then loved him quietly for the rest of her life after he was gone. To understand how staggering his death felt in 1972, you first have to understand what kind of presence Dan Blocker actually was. He wasn't just tall. He wasn't just heavy. He was built on a scale that made strangers stop mid-sentence when he walked into a room. He stood somewhere around 6'4", and at various points in his life his weight crept past 300 pounds. When he was born on December 10, 1928, in the small town of DeKalb, Texas, he reportedly weighed 14 pounds, a number so extreme that locals in Bowie County still point to it as a kind of folk legend, the biggest baby anyone in the area had ever heard of. His parents, Ora, Shaq Blocker, and Mary Arizona Blocker, could not have known that the enormous infant they brought home would grow into one of the most beloved actors in American television, or that his life would be cut short at 43, at the exact moment it seemed most secure. O'Donnell itself was tiny, a farming community of a few hundred people surrounded by wide-open ranch land, the kind of place where Saturday nights were the main event of the week. According to family lore, one of the more unusual pieces of local entertainment during Dan's teenage years involved him directly. Word would spread that if anyone in town wanted to test their strength against the biggest kid around, he'd be waiting on Main Street to take them on. By his own later recollection, he never lost. Even as a young teenager, he weighed close to 275 pounds, and he was confident enough in his physical ability that he once joked he could beat a heavyweight boxing champion if he just had a few months to train and trim down. That kind of self-assurance wasn't empty bravado from a kid who had never been tested. It came from someone who had spent his entire childhood being bigger, stronger, and more capable than nearly everyone around him, and who had never really had reason to doubt it. The family did not have an easy start. The Great Depression hit rural Texas hard, and Shaq Blocker, who had worked the land as a farmer, lost nearly everything along with millions of other Americans. Rather than give up, he moved his family to the small farming town of O'Donnell in West Texas and opened a general store. The Blockers lived in rooms behind the shop, and young Dan grew up helping his father however a boy his size could help, hauling groceries, stocking shelves, and doing the kind of physical labor that most children twice his age couldn't manage. It's easy to imagine a childhood shaped entirely by size and strength, but those who remembered him from those years described something else standing out just as much. He was quiet, he read constantly, and he was polite almost to a fault. The gentle giant that America would eventually fall in love with on Sunday nights wasn't invented by a Hollywood writer's room. It was simply who he already was. His physical gifts eventually pointed him toward football, and by his teenage years he had built a reputation as a serious athlete. He attended the Texas Military Institute in San Antonio, where he played linebacker, served as class president, and was active enough in academics and extracurriculars that he was remembered as far more than just a big kid who could hit hard on the field. After graduating in the mid-1940s, he went on to play college football, first at Hardin-Simmons University in Abilene, and later at Sul-Ross State Teachers College in Alpine, Texas, where his path quietly, almost accidentally, shifted away from athletics and toward the stage. The story of how that shift happened has become one of the most repeated anecdotes about his life, and for good reason. It's the kind of small twist of fate that changes everything. The college drama department needed someone strong enough to move heavy set pieces for a production of Arsenic and Old Lace, and Dan, given his size, was the obvious choice. Somewhere along the way, someone floated the idea that he should also step into a small role in the play itself. He did, and something happened to him that night under the lights that never happened to him on a football field. He felt seen in a completely different way. Not admired for his size, not feared for his strength, but genuinely watched and enjoyed for the character he was creating. He changed his major from English to theater and never looked back. Football scholarships and a future in athletics were quietly set aside for a dream he hadn't even realized he had until he stumbled into it while carrying props. After graduation, instead of pursuing professional football, Blocker headed toward the stage, working in summer stock and repertory theater on the East Coast, and eventually landing a small role on Broadway in a production of King Lear. It looked, for a moment, like the natural next step of an actor's career beginning to take shape. But history had other plans. In late 1950, with the Korean War underway, Dan Blocker was drafted into the United States Army. His military service is one of the most overlooked parts of his story, and it deserves far more attention than it usually gets. After basic training at Fort Polk in Louisiana, he was sent for additional training in Sapporo, Japan, before being deployed to Korea. He served with the infantry, attached to the 179th Infantry Regiment of the 45th Infantry Division, and by the time his service ended, he had risen to the rank of sergeant, effectively functioning as a first sergeant in his unit. His time on the front lines put him through sustained, brutal combat, including extended fighting around outposts that would become infamous in the history of the Korean War. He held defensive positions under heavy enemy fire for hours at a time, and by the account of the men who served with him, he did it with a mixture of raw physical toughness and genuine care for the soldiers around him. One veteran who served under him later described him as strong, loud in the best way, endlessly friendly, and the kind of leader who could crush a beer between two fingers and still make time to check on every man in his unit. His unit endured brutal, sustained combat during that stretch of the war, including fighting near outposts that became notorious flashpoints of the conflict. On one occasion, when a fellow soldier was wounded and pinned down under heavy fire, Blocker reportedly held his position for hours, returning fire against machine guns and mortars to keep the enemy from overrunning the area, even though the wounded man ultimately did not survive. His unit spent well over 200 consecutive days on the front lines before finally being pulled back for rest. By the time he came home, he had earned recognition, including the Purple Heart, the National Defense Service Medal, and the Korean Service Medal with campaign stars, a record of service he rarely brought up in interviews or public appearances once his acting career took off. He came home from Korea decorated for his service, but he rarely spoke about the war in later years. What he did carry with him, quietly and permanently, was a changed relationship with violence. Before Korea, he had enjoyed hunting like a lot of Texas boys his age. After Korea, he wanted nothing to do with guns in his personal life. He would go on to spend more than a decade on a television show built around gunfights and frontier justice, holstering a revolver as part of his costume nearly every day of filming, all while privately despising firearms and refusing to let his own sons go hunting. He believed there was something dishonest about calling it sport to shoot an animal that had no way of shooting back. It was one of the quiet contradictions that defined him. The man audiences saw reaching for a gun on screen was, off camera, someone who had learned in the mountains of Korea exactly how powerless a person becomes the moment someone else is holding the weapon. After returning home in 1952, he married Dolphia Parker, a woman he had met while they were both students at Sul Ross. Dolphia, sometimes called Doll by those close to her, was a small, sharp, steady presence next to her enormous husband, standing barely over 5 feet tall next to a man who towered well over 6. Their marriage would last 20 years, cut short only by his death, and by every account it was a genuinely close partnership built on shared values rather than glamour. With a family quickly growing to include 4 children, twin daughters Deborah Lee and Danilyn, followed by sons David and Dirk, Blocker did what a lot of practical, responsible men of his generation did. He went back to school, earned a master's degree in dramatic arts, and took a teaching job, first as a high school English and drama teacher in Sonora, Texas, and later as a 6th grade teacher in New Mexico. Each move edged him a little farther west, a little closer to a life he wasn't yet sure he wanted, in an industry he hadn't fully committed to. Acting remained a hobby and a possibility, rather than a career for years. When the family eventually settled in California so Blocker could pursue postgraduate work at UCLA, the plan was practical, not glamorous. He wanted a doctorate in dramatic arts, and he kept teaching to support his growing family while he studied. It was only in the mid-1950s, almost as a side hustle to help make ends meet, that he began picking up small television roles. Westerns dominated the airwaves at the time, and a man of his size and presence was a natural fit for the genre. He built experience one small part at a time, appearing in shows like Gunsmoke, The Rifleman, Have Gun Will Travel, and Maverick, developing a reputation as a reliable, likable presence who could handle both drama and comedic timing. There's one small but fascinating footnote to this stretch of his career worth mentioning. Around this time, director Stanley Kubrick considered him for the role of Major T.J. King Kong in Dr. Strangelove, after Peter Sellers decided not to take on the part in addition to the other roles he was already playing. According to the film's co-writer, Blocker's agent turned the project down, and the role eventually went to Slim Pickens instead. It's the kind of near miss that only becomes interesting in hindsight, a road not taken that, had it gone differently, might have completely rewritten the trajectory of his career. Instead, his path led toward a short-lived series called Cimarron City, which didn't last long on the air but ended up being the lucky break in disguise that positioned him for something much bigger. When that show was canceled, Blocker was suddenly free at exactly the moment producer David Dortort was casting a new NBC Western about a wealthy ranching family in Nevada. Dortort cast him as Eric Haas Cartwright, and everything about Blocker's life changed. He put his doctoral studies on hold, likely never imagining that on hold would end up meaning permanently, and became a full-time actor for the first time in his life. Bonanza did not start out as the phenomenon it would become. When it debuted in 1959, ratings were weak enough that NBC seriously considered canceling it after a single season, largely because its original Saturday night time slot pitted it directly against Perry Mason, one of the most popular shows on television at the time. The series didn't even crack the top 30 in its first year. What saved it wasn't just creative instinct. It was a mix of network patience and a savvy business decision. NBC moved the show to Sunday nights at 9 o'clock, a scheduling shift that gave it room to breathe, and the ratings began to climb. Chevrolet's sponsorship gave the show additional financial backing, which mattered enormously because Bonanza, filmed in vivid color at a time when very few shows were, was expensive. Reports from the era put the cost at roughly $15,000 per episode in that first season alone, a genuinely enormous sum for television at the time. Network executives in New York reportedly considered pulling the plug after the first 13 episodes purely because the show had gone over budget. It survived because people within the production fought to keep it on budget and on the air, and once it found its footing on Sunday nights, it became one of the most successful and longest-running series in the history of American television, eventually running for 14 seasons. At the center of it all was Haas Cartwright, and audiences fell for him almost instantly. He was an enormous man who, instead of being intimidating, was gentle, funny, a little awkward, and endlessly kind. His nickname was a playful twist on the word horse, a folksy way of saying someone was as big as one, and it fit the character perfectly. What made Haas work wasn't just the writing, it was how completely Dan Blocker disappeared into him. To millions of viewers, Haas didn't feel like performance. He felt like a real person they knew. The irony, and it's a genuine irony worth sitting with, is that Dan Blocker was almost nothing like the character that made him famous. Where Haas was portrayed as simple, slow, and none too bright, Blocker himself held a master's degree, had spent years as a schoolteacher, and was described by people who knew him as thoughtful, well-read, and intellectually curious. He was a devout Free Methodist and politically progressive for his era, publicly supporting liberal causes and backing anti-war candidates like Eugene McCarthy in the 1968 Democratic primary, before later supporting Hubert Humphrey in the general election. He was, by several accounts, deeply uncomfortable with how much money he was making from acting, at one point telling a reporter that the scale of his wealth felt almost immoral to him. This was a man capable of real self-reflection, playing a character built on the absence of it, and somehow making both feel completely authentic. What Dan Blocker and Haas Cartwright genuinely shared was a bone-deep sense of compassion. Blocker often spoke about carrying a particular quote from the 18th century Quaker missionary Stephen Grellet close to his heart while building the character. The idea that since we only pass this way once, any kindness we're capable of showing should be shown now, because we won't get another chance. That philosophy quietly became the emotional foundation of everything he brought to Haas. Every awkward apology, every gentle gesture, every moment of loyalty to his television family. In the early seasons, Blocker later admitted, the line between himself and the character he played became genuinely blurry. He spent so much time building Haas, studying him, trying to understand how he thought, that for the first couple years he felt like he was Haas Cartwright almost constantly. It wasn't until around the 5th season that he finally felt confident enough to fully separate himself from the role, stepping into Haas each morning on set and leaving him behind on the soundstage each night. Even then, something of Haas never fully left him. Off camera, his toughness showed up in unexpected ways. During one filming session, he was thrown violently from a horse and fractured his collarbone. Rather than head straight to a hospital, he reportedly set the bone himself well enough to finish the scene, only taking time off to properly recover afterward. In a strange twist, he gained weight during that recovery, and when he returned to set, the same horse that had thrown him could no longer carry him. His physical presence naturally made him a favorite subject for reporters looking for a good story, and the numbers around him only added to the myth. Standing well over 6 feet tall and at various points in his adult life, tipping the scales past 300 pounds, he was frequently described as the biggest star on television in the most literal sense possible. Yet almost everyone who worked with him made a point of contrasting his size with his temperament. He could be quick to anger in the moment, according to people who knew him well, but he was just as quick to cool off and apologize when he felt he'd been in the wrong. That same instinct for accountability showed up again and again throughout his life, from the way he handled disagreements on set to the way he approached his own political and social beliefs, never shying away from taking an unpopular stance publicly if he genuinely believed it was the right one.